Callum Hayes strode into his office, his patience already wearing thin. His movements were sharp, controlled, but the frustration in his voice was unmistakable. She did what? Across from him, the HR director shifted uncomfortably, gripping her clipboard a little tighter. Your assistant resigned, sir. Effective immediately, she repeated, her voice cautious. She sent an email this morning. Callum exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. The last thing he needed right now was a disruption in his routine. His company functioned like a well-oiled machine, built on structure and precision. An assistant walking out without notice? That was not part of the equation. Find me a replacement, he ordered, already moving toward his desk. We have, the woman replied, clearing her throat. Temporarily, of course. She's waiting outside. Before Callum could respond, the door opened, and in walked someone he wasn't expecting. The woman standing before him was younger than any assistant he'd had before, mid-20s at most. Her chestnut hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders, and her green eyes met his without the slightest hint of hesitation. She carried herself with confidence, dressed in sleek black slacks and a crisp white blouse. Mr. Hayes, she greeted smoothly, extending her hand. Lillian Carter. I'll be filling in as your assistant. Callum eyed her outstretched hand for a second before shaking it briefly. What's your experience? Not as an assistant, she admitted without hesitation, but I learn quickly, and I don't waste time. He studied her for a beat longer. This wasn't going to work. He didn't have time to train someone new. He needed efficiency. He needed someone who could anticipate his next move without being told. You have one day, he said flatly. If you can't keep up, you're out. Lillian raised an eyebrow but nodded. Fair enough. By midday, Callum had thrown 3 deliberately difficult tasks her way, expecting her to stumble. She didn't. She restructured his packed schedule without missing a beat, tracked down a contract buried in an outdated filing system, and somehow managed to have his coffee order on his desk exactly the way he liked it, without even asking. By the end of the day, Callum found himself watching her with something unexpected, curiosity. I'm assuming you have supernatural abilities, he remarked, accepting the revised itinerary she handed him. Lillian leaned casually against the doorframe, a slight smirk on her lips. Nope, just observant, and maybe a little stubborn. Callum tilted his head slightly. Stubborn? She shrugged. You don't seem like the kind of man who tolerates failure. I figured if I didn't prove myself today, I wouldn't be here tomorrow. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Callum felt a flicker of amusement. Smart, he admitted. She grinned. I try. The following days passed in a blur. Lillian was quick, sharp, and had an uncanny ability to stay 2 steps ahead of him. She wasn't just efficient, she was perceptive. She didn't simply follow orders, she anticipated them. Unlike his previous assistants, she never hesitated to speak up when she disagreed. She challenged his decisions, not out of defiance, but with thoughtful logic. It was something Callum wasn't used to. One evening, as she gathered her things to leave, he caught himself studying her. You know, he said casually, most people find me intimidating. She glanced up, amusement flickering in her eyes. Should I be? That depends, he mused. Do you plan on disappointing me? She laughed, shaking her head. No, Mr. Hayes, I don't. And for the first time in a long while, he actually believed it. Callum felt something unfamiliar, something unexpected. Interest. That morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual, expecting to find the space quiet and empty. Instead, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, accompanied by the rhythmic tapping of a keyboard. At her desk, Lillian was already deep in her work, completely focused. A faint crease lined her forehead as she reviewed a document, her fingers moving swiftly over the keys. She hadn't noticed him yet. Leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, Callum spoke. You're here early. She didn't startle. Instead, she glanced up, hazel eyes sharp with concentration. So are you. I run this company, he pointed out. And I run your schedule, she countered, setting her pen down. Your morning meeting was rescheduled, so I figured I'd get a head start on the day. Callum didn't respond right away. He wasn't used to people anticipating his needs so effortlessly. It was both unsettling and impressive. Efficient, he finally remarked. She stretched her arms, a small smirk tugging at her lips. I try. He studied her for a moment before stepping inside. I need you to accompany me tonight. Her brow lifted slightly. For a charity gala. My assistant is expected to attend. Lillian exhaled, tapping her pen against the desk. I take it that means I'll need something formal. I took the liberty of having a dress sent to your apartment, he said smoothly. She blinked. You did what? Callum checked his watch. It should already be there. Lillian shook her head, letting out a quiet laugh. You're not used to hearing no, are you? No, he admitted, meeting her gaze evenly, and I don't plan on starting now. That evening, as Callum adjusted his cufflinks in the private lounge of the gala venue, the soft click of heels behind him made him turn. And then, everything stopped. Lillian stood in the doorway, wrapped in a deep emerald gown that fit her perfectly. The rich color made her hazel eyes gleam, and the low back of the dress left just enough to the imagination. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Callum found himself momentarily lost for words. She arched a brow. You're staring. He recovered quickly, straightening his tie. With good reason. A flicker of something unreadable passed over her face before she stepped closer. I hope this event is worth the wardrobe change. Try not to sound too thrilled. He murmured dryly, offering his arm. She hesitated for only a second before slipping her hand into the crook of his elbow. The moment they entered the ballroom, heads turned. Callum was used to the attention. He commanded it effortlessly. But tonight, the murmurs weren't just about him. Who is she? His new assistant, apparently. She must be something special. Lillian must have heard them, but if she was rattled, she didn't show it. Instead, she cast him a sidelong glance. I take it you're used to this kind of thing? Ignore them, he advised. It doesn't bother me. And for some reason, he believed her. The evening passed in a blur of champagne, polite small talk, and calculated networking. Lillian adapted seamlessly, matching his pace with ease. She handled introductions with quiet confidence, her charm effortless yet sharp. At one point, an older investor leaned in, eyes glinting with amusement. Callum, you never bring a +1. What's changed? Before he could answer, Lillian beat him to it. He needed someone who wouldn't bore him to death. The older man burst into laughter, clapping Callum on the back. She's a keeper. As the night wore on, Callum found his gaze drifting to her more often than he cared to admit. And he wasn't the only one. Near the bar, a man approached her with a practiced, easygoing smile. I don't believe we've met, he said smoothly. Lillian barely glanced up from her drink. That's probably because we haven't. Before the man could respond, Callum was beside her in an instant. The message was unmistakable as Callum set his glass down with deliberate force. She's not interested. The man standing beside Lillian hesitated, his confident smile faltering. You were just leaving. Callum finished smoothly, his voice low but firm. A pause. Then with a tight nod, the man stepped back and disappeared into the crowd. Lillian watched him go, then turned to Callum, amusement flickering in her eyes. That was unnecessary. He met her gaze. Was it? For a brief moment, something unreadable passed across her expression. Instead of answering, she simply shook her head. You're impossible. For the first time in years, Callum found himself wanting to be. His life had always been structured, every decision calculated, every emotion locked away behind an impenetrable wall. But Lillian Carter was a disruption he hadn't anticipated. And the worst part? He wasn't sure he minded. After the gala, something shifted between them. It was subtle at first. A glance held just a second too long. A brush of hands as she passed him documents. A quiet awareness that hadn't been there before. Callum told himself it was nothing. Then came the weekend business trip. His private jet was prepped and waiting, engines humming as he settled into his seat with a file in hand. Across from him, Lillian adjusted the strap of her carry-on, her expression unreadable. This feels excessive, she noted, glancing around the spacious cabin. Without looking up, Callum responded smoothly. Efficiency isn't excessive. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Of course you'd say that. The flight was smooth. The tension between them was anything but. Every exchange, every seemingly simple interaction, felt charged, weighted with something unspoken. By the time they landed, Callum was no closer to shaking the irritation or the attraction that buzzed beneath his skin. The meeting itself was routine, the negotiation straightforward. But as they exited the sleek conference room, Lillian suddenly pulled him aside. You're about to make a mistake, she murmured, her voice low. Callum arched a brow. Am I? She folded her arms. That contract you're about to sign, the supplier has a history of delayed shipments. I double-checked their recent performance reports. He studied her, mind processing her words swiftly. He hadn't caught that, not because he wasn't thorough, but because he hadn't expected his assistant to be. You're sure? Lillian didn't flinch under his scrutiny. Completely. Without another word, Callum pivoted, returning to the negotiating table. Lillian stood just behind him, silent but unwavering, as he coolly pushed back on the terms. Across from them, the opposing party scrambled to explain themselves. By the time they left with a significantly improved deal, Callum turned to her, something dangerously close to admiration flickering in his gaze. You just saved us millions. She shrugged, though a glint of satisfaction danced in her eyes. I told you, I'm observant. Callum studied her for a long moment. Lillian wasn't just capable. She was exceptional, and that was becoming a problem. That night, after a long day of negotiations, a dinner reservation had been arranged at one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city. It was meant to be just another business dinner, an extension of the trip, nothing more. But the moment she stepped into the candlelit space, dressed in something understated yet effortlessly elegant, Callum knew nothing about this evening would be routine. The conversation flowed easily, the usual sharp banter softened by the warm glow of the city lights through the towering windows. And somewhere between the first course and the second, he learned things about her that weren't listed on any resume. That she once wanted to be a journalist. That she had a habit of tapping her fingers when deep in thought. That she carried an old, worn notebook filled with ideas. And for the first time in a long while, Callum found himself wanting to know more. Lillian asked questions no one else dared to. Do you ever get tired of it? She asked, absently swirling the wine in her glass. Callum glanced at her. Tired of what? The endless cycle. Deals, negotiations, power plays. No one had ever asked him that before. For a moment, he considered brushing it off, steering the conversation elsewhere as he always did. But instead, he found himself answering honestly. It's what I built my life around. His gaze held hers, unreadable. That's not what I asked. She could have let it go. He could have given her the polished, yet controlled response he gave everyone else. But something about the way she looked at him, like she already knew the answer, made him hesitate. And then, before he could stop himself, he admitted, sometimes. She didn't look surprised. Instead, there was something knowing in her expression, like she had already guessed it. Then why keep doing it? Because stopping isn't an option. Lillian tilted her head slightly, studying him as though weighing her next words carefully. Maybe it should be. The thought lingered. Long after dinner ended. Long after they returned to the hotel, where separate rooms awaited them. Long after he found himself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, unsettled in a way he didn't fully understand. By the time they returned to the office on Monday, Callum had convinced himself it was nothing. Then came the moment that shattered that illusion. A rival firm had made her an offer, one that could take her away from his company. The news reached him through a casual mention from another executive. But the impact? That was anything but casual. It hit like a gut punch. He found her in the office kitchen, pouring herself a cup of coffee, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. You got another job offer. Lillian stilled for half a second before glancing at him over her shoulder. Word travels fast. Callum stepped closer, his voice controlled but edged with something raw. Are you taking it? She exhaled, setting her cup down. I haven't decided. That wasn't good enough. They can't offer you what I can. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Lillian blinked, caught off guard. Callum, she said softly. The way she said his name, it wasn't just acknowledgement. It was a warning, a plea, a challenge. She studied him, searching his face for something. Something he wasn't sure he was ready to name. This isn't just about work, is it? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. For the first time in his life, Callum Hayes was on the verge of losing control, and for the first time he wasn't sure he wanted it back. His entire career had been built on control, on ensuring that nothing and no one held power over him. But as he stood there, staring at Lillian, he realized something. She had unraveled every rule he lived by. Without even trying, she was waiting for an answer, her eyes holding his with quiet determination. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, threatening to pull words from his lips he had never spoken to anyone. But she beat him to it. "I don't want to leave." Her voice was steady, but something raw lurked beneath it. "But I can't stay if it means pretending this is just another job." His pulse kicked up. He wasn't used to being confronted like this. Wasn't used to someone stripping away all the layers of pretense, forcing him to face what was right in front of him. He stepped closer, the space between them vanishing. "You think I want to pretend?" His voice was lower than he intended, rough with something unfamiliar. She searched his face, her breath catching slightly. "I don't know what you want." That was the problem. Neither had he. Until now. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, Callum reached for her. The moment their lips met, the world outside ceased to exist. Lillian's hands gripped the fabric of his shirt, as if she needed something to hold on to. The kiss was urgent, unrestrained, a collision of everything unspoken, every stolen glance, every moment they had ignored. And there was no turning back. The moment had been inevitable. The tension between them, unspoken yet undeniable, had been building for too long. Callum wasn't gentle. He didn't know how to be. His fingers tangled in Lillian's hair, pulling her closer, desperate to make her understand that this wasn't something fleeting. This wasn't something he could ignore or walk away from. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Lillian's hands were still fisted in his shirt. Her wide eyes held something that looked dangerously close to hope. Callum cupped her face, his thumb brushing along her cheek. "This was never just a job to me." A shaky laugh escaped her. "You have a terrible way of showing it." He exhaled sharply, resting his forehead against hers. "I don't know how to do this." She smiled, and for the first time, he realized how much he needed to see that expression, needed to know it was because of him. "Then we'll figure it out." For years, Callum had believed that love was a weakness, that attachments were distractions he couldn't afford. But standing there, holding Lillian, he realized something else. He had never felt stronger than he did in that moment. Because for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of stolen moments and late-night whispers. For now, they kept things private. Not because Callum cared about rumors. He never had. But because Lillian was still finding her footing in this world. She had worked too hard to build a reputation of her own, and he refused to be the reason people questioned it. Still, despite their best efforts, the shift between them did not go unnoticed. At a board meeting, one of the senior executives made a passing remark about how Callum's assistant seemed particularly well informed about his schedule. The implication was clear. Lillian remained composed, meeting the comment with quiet professionalism, but Callum had to resist the urge to shut it down with a single glare. Later, when they were alone in his office, she leaned against his desk, arms crossed. "This isn't going to stay a secret forever." Callum leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. "Do you want it to?" She hesitated, then softly, "No." Something in his chest eased. "Then we won't." She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "It's just, I've worked too hard to be taken seriously. I don't want people assuming I got here because of us." Callum stood, stepping around his desk until he was right in front of her. "Anyone who thinks that doesn't deserve to be in this company." A small smile tugged at her lips. "You always have an answer, don't you?" He brushed his fingers along her jaw. "Only when it comes to you." A week later, they attended another gala. This time, there was no pretense. When they arrived, Callum made no effort to keep his distance, his hand resting at the small of her back as they moved through the crowd. The whispers started immediately. He heard them, felt the weight of curious gazes following their every move. But for the first time, he didn't care. At one point, a reporter approached, microphone in hand. "Mr. Hayes, there have been rumors circulating about your relationship with your assistant. Care to confirm?" Callum didn't hesitate. He turned to Lillian, took her hand in his, and in front of the entire room, pressed a slow, deliberate kiss to her knuckles. "She's not just my assistant," he said, his voice carrying through the crowd. "She's the only thing in my life I refuse to let go of." Lillian's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around his. The reporter blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "So you're confirming the relationship?" Callum met Lillian's gaze, his lips twitching slightly. "I don't think there's any doubt left." By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Callum Hayes' secret romance, no longer a secret. The Millionaire CEO and his assistant, more than just business. Lillian sat at her desk, phone in hand, shaking her head. And Callum? He just smirked. Lillian skimmed through the article on her phone, then read aloud with an amused tone. Well, subtlety was never your strong suit. Callum smirked, tugging her closer. Remind me, did you want me to be subtle? She laughed, looping her arms around his neck. No. He kissed her, slow, deep, deliberate, savoring the way she melted into him. Callum Hayes had spent his life building an empire, ensuring that nothing and no one could shake him. But then Lillian Carter walked into his world and changed everything. And he wouldn't have it any other way. The morning after their relationship became public, Lillian arrived at the office expecting business as usual. Instead, she stepped into an entirely different atmosphere. People stared, some subtly, others not at all. Conversations hushed as she walked past, only to pick up again in hushed whispers the moment she was out of earshot. Even the executive assistants, who had always been strictly professional, exchanged knowing glances when she entered the break room. She kept her back straight as she poured herself a cup of coffee. She had worked too hard to let other people's opinions shake her now. But when she turned around, Callum was there, standing in the doorway, watching her. His expression was unreadable. Without a word, he stepped forward, plucked the coffee cup from her hands, and set it on the counter. Then he laced his fingers through hers and led her out of the room. They walked past rows of desks, past employees who pretended not to watch, past senior executives suddenly very engrossed in their emails. Callum acknowledged none of them. When they reached his office, he shut the door behind them. Lillian crossed her arms. So is this where you tell me I should have taken the other job offer? Callum leaned against his desk, studying her. Do you want to? She narrowed her eyes. You know I don't. Then stop acting like this changes anything. She exhaled sharply. It does change things, Callum. You might not care what people say, but I still have to walk through this office every day and deal with the fallout. His gaze remained steady. Anyone who questions your place here is welcome to leave. Lillian shook her head, exasperation flickering across her face. You can't fire half the company just because they gossip. I can, actually. A surprised laugh escaped her. That's not how this works. Callum pushed off the desk and closed the space between them. I know you didn't sign up for this, he said quietly, and I know you can handle it. But if anyone makes you feel like you don't belong here, I need to know. Something in her expression softened. The tension in her shoulders eased, just slightly. I can handle the whispers, Callum. I just don't want people thinking I didn't earn my place here. His fingers brushed against her wrist, deliberate. No one who matters would ever think that. Her pulse steadied. He had a way of cutting through the noise, of making everything else seem irrelevant when he looked at her like that. Finally, she exhaled. I guess I'll just have to prove them wrong. A flicker of something like pride crossed his face. You already have. Despite the office murmurs, Lillian refused to let the tension define her. If anything, she worked harder, more determined than ever to prove that her position wasn't contingent on her relationship with Callum Hayes. She handled negotiations with sharp efficiency, caught errors others had missed, and streamlined internal operations in a way that even the most seasoned executives struggled to keep up with. By the end of the week, the whispers had shifted, from gossip to grudging respect. And on Friday evening, Callum finally decided she had worked enough. He arrived at Lillian's desk just as she was reviewing yet another contract. Without preamble, he plucked the document from her hands and set it aside. She raised an eyebrow. I wasn't done with that. You are now. Before she could protest, he reached for her coat, lifting it from the back of her chair. Instead of handing it to her, he slipped it over her shoulders, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary. She sighed. Are you kidnapping me? He didn't answer, just took her hand and guided her toward his private elevator. When the doors opened, they stepped out onto the rooftop of a high-rise she didn't recognize. The entire city stretched before them, glittering under the night sky. A private table sat beneath strands of golden lights, the kind that made everything feel impossibly intimate. Lillian turned to him, suspicious. You planned this. Callum slid his hands into his pockets. I don't like surprises, but I thought you might. She laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. You say that a lot, because it's true. Still, she let him pull out her chair. Let herself sink into the moment. Let herself acknowledge that, maybe, just maybe, she wasn't entirely immune to grand gestures. As the evening stretched on, conversation flowed as easily as the wine. They talked about everything and nothing, about the places Lillian wanted to visit, about the rare moments Callum allowed himself to step away from work. Then, as dessert arrived, he reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the table between them. A key. Lillian stared at it, then at him. Callum met her gaze without hesitation. Move in with me. Her breath caught. Callum, I know it's fast, he admitted, but I don't want to waste time pretending I don't know exactly what I want. She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because it felt like stepping over an invisible line she hadn't been ready to acknowledge before. Callum leaned forward, his voice quieter now. I don't do things halfway, Lillian. You know that. She did. She also knew that despite every warning she had given herself, despite every logical reason to take things slow, she wanted this. Finally, she picked up the key, turning it over in her fingers before slipping it into her purse. Callum's lips curved slightly. Is that a yes? She exhaled. It's a you're insufferable, but yes. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. Good, good. And just like that, the last wall between them crumbled. The weeks that followed felt effortless. Lillian adjusted to her new reality, waking up to the scent of coffee already brewed, to Callum reading through business reports at the kitchen counter, to stolen kisses before they left for work. She learned that, despite his ruthless efficiency in business, he had a habit of leaving his ties draped over random furniture, that he preferred his whiskey neat but took his coffee with exactly 1 sugar, that he slept deeply but always woke the second she moved. And Callum? He learned that Lillian talked in her sleep sometimes, that she had an oddly specific love for thunderstorms, that she always double-checked the locks before going to bed, that she hummed under her breath when she was deep in thought. Their lives intertwined seamlessly, as if this had been inevitable all along. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of his penthouse, Lillian leaned into his side, resting her head against his shoulder. Still think stopping isn't an option, she murmured. Callum's arm tightened around her. Stopping? She tilted her head to look up at him, her expression teasing. The endless cycle. Deals, negotiations, power moves. He considered that for a moment, his gaze lingering on her. Then, without hesitation, he pressed a slow kiss to her temple. For you, Callum said, his voice quieter than usual but no less certain. Anything is an option. And for the first time in his life, Callum Hayes knew there was something more important than power, more valuable than any deal. Because Lillian Carter hadn't just stolen his heart, she had become the only thing in his world that truly mattered. The transition from working together to sharing a home had been surprisingly smooth. Still, there were moments when Lillian would pause, trying to grasp how much had changed in such a short time. She had gone from being a temporary assistant to the woman standing beside one of the most powerful men in the city. And while she had never doubted her own capabilities, adjusting to the shift in her personal life was something else entirely. Callum, for all his intensity in the boardroom, made it seem effortless. He never hesitated, never second-guessed. If he wanted something, he pursued it with the same precision he applied to every aspect of his empire. And right now, she was that something. Late one evening, Lillian curled up on the couch in Callum's penthouse, reviewing a proposal. Across the room, he stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm, controlled, but the tension in his shoulders told her the conversation wasn't an easy one. She didn't ask. If he wanted to tell her, he would. When the call finally ended, he didn't turn around right away. Instead, he stayed there, his hands braced on the window ledge, staring out at the city skyline. Lillian set her papers aside and stood, crossing the room until she was beside him. Bad news? She asked softly. He exhaled slowly. An old competitor trying to make a move, nothing I can't handle. She studied his profile, taking in the faint crease between his brows. You don't have to handle everything alone, you know. His gaze flicked to her, something unreadable in his expression. I always have. Without hesitation, she reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Maybe it's time to change that. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his grip tightened around hers, a silent acknowledgement that he understood what she was offering. The next morning, Lillian arrived at the office earlier than usual, eager to get ahead of the day. As she settled in, one of the senior executives approached her desk. There was nothing overtly hostile in his demeanor, but there was something in his tone that made her pause. "I assume you've heard about the pushback from the board?" he said, watching her carefully. She met his gaze evenly. "I have." He hesitated before continuing. "Some of them are concerned about your position here, about whether it compromises Callum's judgment." Lillian had expected this eventually. What she hadn't expected was the quiet confidence that settled over her as she responded. "If they're questioning my abilities, they're welcome to look at my track record," she said evenly. "I've done more in the last few months than some of them have in years." The executive's expression flickered, but he didn't argue. Before he could say anything else, another voice interrupted. "I'd be careful about where this conversation is heading." Callum. His presence was unmistakable. He hadn't raised his voice, but the weight behind his words was undeniable. The executive straightened, clearing his throat. "I was only expressing concerns raised by the board." Callum's gaze darkened. "Lillian's position here isn't up for discussion. Anyone who thinks otherwise is free to find employment elsewhere." The man gave a stiff nod before retreating. Lillian turned toward Callum. Lillian raised an eyebrow. "You know I can fight my own battles." Callum studied her for a moment, his expression softening just slightly. "I know," he said simply. "But that doesn't mean I'll let anyone question what you've earned." Warmth spread through her chest, but she kept her tone light. "You do realize you just terrified half the office, right?" He didn't look remotely concerned. Good. Later that evening, Callum had another surprise waiting for her. Instead of heading home after work, he led her toward a sleek black car waiting outside. She slid into the passenger seat, casting him a curious glance. "Where are we going?" "You'll see." The drive was quiet, the city lights blurring past as they moved farther away from the towering skyscrapers. When they finally arrived, Lillian stepped out and took in her surroundings. A private villa, nestled right at the water's edge. Soft lanterns illuminated the pathway, their glow casting flickering shadows against the walls. The air smelled of salt and jasmine, a stark contrast to the usual scent of the city. Callum held out his hand. "Come on." She took it, letting him lead her inside. The space was warm, inviting, so different from the sleek modern precision of his penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the ocean, and a private terrace stretched out toward the waves. Lillian turned to him, realization dawning. "This is yours." He nodded. "I bought it years ago. Never really had a reason to come here much." She glanced around, taking in the details. The untouched books lining the shelves, the perfectly maintained but rarely used furniture. Something in her chest tightened. "You brought me here for a reason." Callum didn't deny it. Instead, he stepped closer, his hands settling at her waist. "I wanted you to see a part of my life outside of all of it. The business, the pressure, the expectations." She swallowed, her fingers resting lightly against his chest. "And what is this part?" His gaze held hers, steady and unguarded. "The part I only want to share with you." Her breath hitched. Before she could respond, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Her pulse jumped. Callum Hayes had never been a man who wasted time. When he made a decision, he followed through, with certainty, with conviction. He opened the box. Inside, a single emerald stone surrounded by delicate diamonds gleamed under the soft light. Lillian's heart pounded. "I don't want to wait," Callum said, his voice quiet but firm. "I don't want to waste another second pretending I could ever go back to a life that doesn't have you in it." She stared at him, at the man who had once been nothing more than an impossible boss, at the man who had become everything. A million thoughts swirled in her mind, but only one mattered. She reached for the ring, her fingers brushing against his. "Yes?" The word left her lips before she had time to second-guess it. Callum slid the ring onto her finger, his grip tightening around her hand, a silent promise. And when he kissed her, slow and deep, Lillian knew there was no going back. This wasn't just another chapter. It was the beginning of forever. And just like that, their story begins. Not as an ending, but as the start of something far greater than either of them had ever imagined. Thank you for joining us on this journey. For every moment of tension, every stolen glance, and every whispered confession, we hope this story has touched your heart in some way. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, keep believing in love, in destiny, and in the magic of unexpected beginnings. Bookmark, go back. See you in the next story.